He had prayed to the spirits for children until his voice cracked like drought-split earth. But the Great Spirit had answered with empty cradles and a wife's tears that dried up, like summer streams. Then 7 small voices cried out from the heart of a killing dust storm, and Izatai Pieroa discovered that sometimes the spirits answer prayers in ways that break you open to rebuild you stronger. The year was 1847, and the Texas plains stretched endlessly under a sky that had forgotten the color of mercy. Izatai Pieroa knelt beside the dried creek bed that had once run clear and cold through his people's winter camp, his weathered hands sifting through dust that should have been mud. The Comanche had always been a people of movement, following the buffalo herds across the vast grasslands, but this land had been their sanctuary during the harsh months when the north winds carried ice and death. Now it was nothing but cracked earth and the bones of fish that had trusted the water to return.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
At 32 winters, Izatai had earned his place among the respected warriors of his band through countless battles against Apache raiders and Mexican soldados, but the greatest war he had ever fought was the one that raged silently within his own lodge. His wife Ayana had been the most beautiful woman in 3 tribes when he had won her through feats of horsemanship and courage that still echoed in the stories told around winter fires. She had the laugh of summer rain and hands that could heal wounded animals or weave baskets so perfect they seemed touched by spirits. But for 7 years of marriage, those same hands had reached desperately for children that never came. The medicine man Tequishana had performed every ritual known to bring forth new life, burning sacred herbs and calling upon the fertility spirits until the smoke made the stars themselves seem to dance. Ayana had drunk bitter teas made from roots gathered under the full moon, and slept with charms sewn from the fur of mother wolves. Izatai had fasted until his ribs showed through his skin and offered his finest horses to the spirits in exchange for the sound of a baby's cry echoing through their tipi. Nothing worked. The other women in the tribe grew round with promise, while Ayana grew thin with grief, and eventually her laughter dried up like everything else in this cursed land. 3 moons ago, during the season when the cottonwood should have been green with new growth, Ayana had simply stopped speaking. She would rise each morning, tend to their small fire, prepare meals that neither of them could taste, and stare out across the empty plains as if waiting for something that would never come. When Izatai tried to comfort her, she would turn away like a wounded animal seeking solitude to die. The silence between them grew heavier than the oppressive heat that pressed down on the prairie day after day. Then came the morning when Izatai woke to find her side of their sleeping robes cold and empty. He found her sitting by the dead creek, braiding grass with mechanical precision, her eyes vacant as winter sky. "The spirits have spoken," she said without looking at him, her voice carrying no more emotion than wind through empty branches. "I am a woman who will never know the weight of a child at her breast. You are a warrior who will never teach a son to draw a bow or show a daughter how to read the stories written in the stars." That afternoon, Ayana walked into the prairie, without a word, following a path only she could see. Izatai tracked her for 2 days until he found her body beside a small spring that still held water, the morning dew collecting on her peaceful face like the tears she had finally stopped shedding. She had braided her hair with wildflowers and laid down as gently as if settling in for a pleasant dream. In her hand was a small wooden cradle board that Izatai had carved during their first winter together, when hope still bloomed in their hearts like prairie roses. Izatai buried his wife according to the old ways, wrapping her in buffalo hide, painted with symbols that would guide her spirit to the happy hunting grounds, where children's laughter echoed like birdsong. But when the mourning period ended and the other warriors expected him to rejoin the hunt, to find another wife, to continue the circle of life as their people had done for countless generations, Izatai found that his spirit had followed Ayana. Into the realm of shadows, he began riding alone across the endless grassland, leaving the safety of the band to wander like a ghost among the living. Chief Horseback, his childhood friend and the leader of their band, tried to call him back to duty, but Izatai's ears had grown deaf to everything except the sound of wind across empty land. He would disappear for days at a time, following game. Trails that led nowhere, sleeping under stars that offered no comfort, waking each dawn to another day of existing without purpose. The drought had been merciless that summer, turning the usually green prairie into a wasteland of dust and dying grass. Even the buffalo had moved north, following water sources that still flowed clean and cold. The Comanche bands were scattered across hundreds of miles, each searching for grazing land that could sustain their horses and families through the coming winter. It was a time of hardship that tested the endurance of even the strongest warriors, but for Izatai, the external drought merely matched the barren landscape of his own heart. On this particular morning, as he rode his paint horse Thunder Walker across a stretch of cracked earth that had once been a lake, Izatai was returning from yet another aimless journey into the emptiness. He had been gone for 6 days, living on dried meat and water from muddy buffalo wallows, seeking something he could not name in the vast silence of the plains. The sun hung like a malevolent eye in the cloudless sky, and the wind carried the scent of dust and approaching death. Thunder Walker snorted nervously, his ears pricking forward as if sensing something that human senses could not detect. Izatai had learned to trust his horse's instincts during their long partnership, and now he reined in the animal to study the horizon more carefully. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar shimmer of heat waves rising from baked earth. Then, far to the east, he noticed a darkness spreading across the sky like spilled ink, a dust storm. But not the gentle dust devils that danced across the prairie during dry seasons. This was something massive and terrible, a wall of earth and wind that devoured everything in its path. Izatai had lived through dozens of such storms during his lifetime, and he knew the signs of one that could kill the unwary. This monster was moving fast, driven by winds that spoke of destruction and chaos. Any sensible person would seek shelter immediately, find a deep arroyo or rocky outcropping to wait out nature's fury. But Izatai was no longer a sensible person. He was a man whose spirit had already died, whose body was merely going through the motions of living. As he watched the approaching wall of dust, he felt something stir in his chest that he had not experienced since Ayana's death. Not hope exactly, but perhaps curiosity about whether the storm might finally carry him to join his wife in the spirit world. Thunder Walker pranced anxiously beneath him, clearly wanting to flee from the approaching danger. But Izatai held the reins steady, watching the storm grow larger and more terrible with each passing moment. The darkness stretched from earth to sky, and within its depths he could hear the roar of wind that sounded like the voices of angry spirits. This was the kind of storm that buried entire buffalo herds under tons of dust, that turned day into night and left even experienced plainsmen lost and helpless. The storm struck with the fury of 1,000 war ponies charging across the heavens. One moment Izatai could see the familiar landmarks of his territory, and the next he was enveloped in a world of choking darkness where the air itself had become solid. The wind screamed like tortured souls, driving particles of sand and dirt with enough force to strip hide from bone. Thunder Walker whinnied in terror, spinning in circles as he tried to find direction in the chaos. Izatai pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, squinting through eyes that burned and wept from the assault of flying debris. Visibility dropped to mere inches as the storm transformed the world into a hellscape of dust and fury. He had experienced sandstorms before, but nothing like this monument to nature's wrath. This was the kind of weather that the old men spoke of in hushed tones, the killer storms that could bury entire villages and leave no trace that people had ever lived there. Thunder Walker stumbled, nearly throwing his rider as they struggled against winds that seemed determined to knock them
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Down and bury them alive. Isatai leaned low over his horse's neck, using his body to shield both of them from the worst of the assault. But even as he fought for survival, part of him remained strangely calm, almost welcoming the possibility that this storm might be the doorway to joining Ayana in whatever realm awaited beyond this world of endless pain. Then, cutting through, the howl of wind and the rattle of dust against his ears, Isatai heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A sound so unexpected and impossible that at first he thought the storm was playing tricks on his mind. It was a human voice, thin and desperate, calling for help from somewhere in the chaos. Not the deep cry of a man or the higher pitch of a woman, but something that made his warrior's heart clench with recognition and disbelief. A child's scream, carried on the wind like a prayer to spirits who might already be too late to answer. Isatai's head snapped up, his body instantly alert despite the danger that surrounded them. In 7 years of marriage, he had dreamed of hearing a child's voice call to him, had imagined countless times what it would feel like to be needed by a small person who depended on his strength and protection. Now in the middle of a storm that threatened to kill them all, the spirits had finally sent him the sound he had longed for more than breath itself. "Did you hear that?" He shouted to Thunder Walker, knowing the horse could not answer, but needing to voice the desperate hope that was suddenly burning in his chest like a signal fire. The wind snatched his words away before they could travel 3 feet, but the horse's ears were pricked forward, listening intently. Thunder Walker had heard it too. The cry came again, fainter this time, but unmistakably real. Not one voice, but several, calling out in terror and desperation from somewhere ahead in the wall of dust. Isatai spurred Thunder Walker forward, abandoning all thought of self-preservation as he rode blindly into the heart of the storm. Every instinct screamed at him to seek shelter, to wait out the tempest in safety, but something deeper than instinct was driving him now. For the first time since Ayana's death, Isatai Piaroa had a purpose. Finding them in the chaos was like trying to locate specific grains of sand in a desert made of wind and fury. Isatai rode in expanding circles, calling out whenever the wind paused for breath, listening for any response that might guide him to the source of those desperate voices. Thunder Walker fought against the rains, his horse sense urging retreat from the madness, but Isatai drove them deeper into the storm with the determination of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. The first body he nearly rode over was small and still, half buried in a drift of sand that had formed around what looked like the remains of a covered wagon. Isatai threw himself from Thunder Walker's back, dropping to his knees beside the motionless form. It was a boy, perhaps 8 years old, with pale skin burned raw by wind and sand. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes crusted shut with dirt, but when Isatai pressed his ear to the child's chest, he heard the faint flutter of a heartbeat that refused to surrender. "Can you hear me?" Isatai shouted over the storm, gently brushing sand from the boy's face. "I am here to help you. Where are the others?" The child's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Isatai with the kind of trust that only the very young or very desperate can show to strangers. His lips moved, but no sound emerged from his dust-filled throat. Instead, he raised one trembling hand and pointed toward what remained of the wagon. Isatai followed the boy's gesture and found them huddled together like a litter of abandoned wolf cubs, 6 more children ranging in age from what looked like 4 years to perhaps 14. They had taken shelter under the overturned wagon bed, which had provided some protection from the worst of the flying debris but was slowly being buried by the accumulating dust. Some were conscious and crying, others lay still as death, and all of them bore the marks of exposure and terror. 2 girls who might have been twins, both with corn silk hair turned gray with dust, clung to each other with the fierce desperation of those who knew they were each other's only hope. An older boy, perhaps 12 or 13, had wrapped himself around a smaller child, using his own body as a shield against the storm's fury. A girl of maybe 10 sat rocking back and forth, her eyes staring at nothing, her lips moving in what might have been prayers, or simply the last words of a mind pushed beyond endurance. But it was the oldest child, a girl who looked to be 14 or 15, who broke Izatai's heart completely. She was conscious and aware, trying to comfort the younger ones even as blood seeped from cuts on her face and arms. When she saw Izatai approach, she pushed herself up on trembling elbows and tried to speak, though her voice was barely a whisper above the wind. "Please," she managed to croak, "save the little ones first. I can wait." In that moment, as Izatai looked into the eyes of this brave girl who was willing to sacrifice herself for children who might not even be her blood relatives, he felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut. Since Ayana's death, these were not his children by birth, but the spirits had sent them to him in his darkest hour, crying out for the protection and love that he had been storing up unused for 7 barren years. "I am taking all of you," he told her, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even him. "No one gets left behind. That is my promise to you." Working with desperate efficiency, Izatai began gathering the children like precious cargo, wrapping each one in whatever fabric he could salvage from the destroyed wagon. Thunder Walker stood steady despite the chaos, seeming to understand the importance of their mission as Izatai loaded first one child, then another onto the horse's broad back. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and he knew they had only minutes before the accumulating dust buried them all alive. The unconscious ones were the most difficult to transport, dead weight that threatened to slip from his grasp with every step. But Izatai had carried wounded warriors from battlefields, had learned to manage burdens that would break ordinary men. Now he drew upon every lesson in strength and endurance that life had taught him, lifting each small body with the care of a man handling sacred objects. When he finally had all 7 children secured on Thunder Walker, the horse looked like a mobile refugee camp, small arms and legs protruding from bundles of cloth and torn canvas. But Thunder Walker was a war pony, trained to carry wounded riders away from danger, and he accepted his burden without complaint. The children who were conscious held onto each other and the horse's mane with whatever strength they had left, while Izatai led them all through the chaos toward what he hoped was safety. The trek to shelter became an odyssey through a landscape, transformed into something from the spirit world's darkest nightmares. Izatai had to navigate by instinct and memory, following barely visible landmarks that appeared and disappeared in the swirling dust like mirages. Thunder Walker followed his lead with the trust that came from years of partnership, placing each hoof carefully to avoid the hidden ravines and buffalo wallows that could break a leg or trap them all in the storm's fury. One of the smaller children, a girl who could not have been more than 5, developed a rattling cough that spoke of dust in her lungs and the beginning of the death that claimed travelers caught in such storms. Izatai stopped frequently to give her water from his buffalo hide water bag, tilting her head back and letting precious drops fall between her cracked lips. Each time he thought she might not take another breath, but each time those small lungs found the strength to keep fighting. The boy he had found first, whose name he learned was Tommy when the child whispered it during a brief lull in the wind, had regained enough strength to help watch over the others. Despite his own injuries and exhaustion, Tommy kept talking to the unconscious children, telling them stories and jokes in a voice barely audible above the storm. Izatai found himself marveling at the courage of these small people, their determination to care for each other even in the face of death. As they struggled through the endless dust and darkness, Izatai began to piece together their story from fragments whispered by the conscious children. They were homesteader kids from a settlement called Cedar Creek, traveling with their families in a wagon train that had been caught in the storm. Their parents and other adults had tried to create a shelter using the wagons, But the wind had been too strong, the dust too thick. In the chaos of flying debris and panic animals, families had been separated, children scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Mama told me to hold on to Sarah's hand no matter what. The oldest girl, whose name was Rebecca, managed to tell him during one of their rest stops. But the wind was so strong, and something hit me in the head, and when I woke up I was buried in the dirt. I found the others by following their voices. The thought of parents somewhere in this hellstorm, desperately searching for their lost children, filled Izatai with a determination that burned hotter than the pain in his chest from breathing. Dust-filled air. These 7 small souls had been entrusted to his care by circumstances beyond any mortal understanding. Whether their parents were alive or dead, whether there was a settlement waiting for them or only empty land, he would see them through this trial. It took nearly 4 hours to travel what should have been a 1-hour ride to the sheltered canyon, where Izatai knew they could wait out the storm. By the time they reached the narrow entrance between 2 towering rock walls, both he and Thunder Walker were staggering with exhaustion. The horse had carried 7 children plus their improvised supplies without complaint, but even his legendary endurance was reaching its limits. The canyon was a place Izatai had discovered years ago during his vision quest as a young man. A hidden valley protected from wind by high walls and blessed with a spring that ran clear even in the driest seasons. Ancient pictographs covered the rock walls, painted by people whose names were lost to time but whose spirits still watched over this sacred place. If there was anywhere on the plains where 7 lost children might find sanctuary, it was here, among the ancestors who had also known hardship and survival. As they entered the blessed silence of the protected canyon, Izatai felt the storm's fury diminish to a distant roar beyond the rock walls. For the first time in hours, he could hear his own breathing, could speak without shouting, could see more than a few inches in any direction. Thunder Walker practically collapsed with relief, his sides heaving as he finally allowed himself to rest, but his eyes' work was far from finished. 7 children lay before him, some conscious and others still locked in the unconsciousness that might be their mind's way of protecting them from trauma too great to bear. They needed water, food, medical attention, and most of all, they needed to know that they were safe, that someone strong enough to protect them had taken responsibility for their lives, as he began the careful process of making them comfortable. In their temporary sanctuary, building a fire to warm them and using his medical knowledge to treat their injuries, Izatai Piaroa realized that something fundamental had changed in the deepest part of his spirit. For the first time since Ayana's death, he was no longer thinking about his own pain, his own loss, his own desire to join his wife in the spirit world. Instead, he was thinking about tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the tomorrows. That these 7 children would need someone to fight for them, someone to stand between them and a world that had already shown them more cruelty than any small person should have to endure. The Great Spirit had finally answered his prayers for children, but not in any way he could have imagined when he was a young man dreaming of sons who would carry his name and daughters who would learn their mother's songs. These children would never call him father, might never even stay with him long enough to learn his true name. But in this moment, as the storm raged outside their sanctuary and 7 small lives depended on his strength and wisdom, Izatai understood that fatherhood was not about blood or tribal laws or the conventional bonds that people expected. It was about choice, about love, about standing between the helpless and the harm that would devour them. Dawn broke over the hidden canyon like a whispered promise that the world might still hold beauty after witnessing so much destruction. Izatai had not slept during the long night, keeping watch over 7 small forms, bundled around the dying embers of his fire while the storm raged itself to exhaustion beyond the protective rock walls. Now as the first pale light filtered down from the canyon rim, he could finally see the full extent of what the spirits had entrusted to his care. The children ranged in age from little Martha, who could not have seen more than 4 summers, To Rebecca, the brave girl who had tried to sacrifice herself for the others and who, Isatai guessed, had lived through 14 or 15 winters. Between them lay Tommy, the 8-year-old boy whose whispered name had been the first word spoken in their sanctuary, and the twins Sarah and Mary, both around 6 years old with identical freckled faces now streaked with dust and dried tears. There was also James, perhaps 10 years old, who had not spoken a single word since Isatai found him, and Benjamin, who looked to be 12 and whose left arm hung at an unnatural angle that spoke of bones broken in the chaos of the storm. But it was the 7th child who troubled Isatai most deeply. Little David, who appeared to be about 5 years old, had not regained consciousness since being pulled from the wreckage of the wagon train. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and when Isatai lifted his eyelids to check his pupils, the boy's eyes rolled back, showing only white. The child had taken a severe blow to the head during the storm, and Isatai had seen enough battlefield injuries to recognize the signs of damage that might never heal completely. As the canyon filled with morning light, the children began to stir one by one, their movements tentative and fearful as they awakened to find themselves in an unfamiliar place with a stranger who looked nothing like the people they had known all their lives. Isatai understood their caution. To these young homesteaders, raised on stories of savage Indians who stole children and burned settlements, his bronze skin and long black hair marked him as something to be feared rather than trusted. Rebecca was the first to fully wake, pushing herself up on her elbows and scanning the canyon with the quick, alert movements of someone who had learned not to trust a parent's safety. When her eyes met Isatai's across the dying fire, he saw her entire body tense as if preparing to run or fight, despite her injuries and exhaustion. But then her gaze shifted to the other children still sleeping peacefully around the fire, and understanding dawned in her expression. "You saved us," she said, her voice still hoarse from the dust, but carrying a note of wonder that made Isatai's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "The storm was going to kill us all, and you came into it to find us." Isatai nodded once, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. In the growing light, he could see that Rebecca's injuries were more extensive than he had realized during the chaos of the rescue. Deep cuts crisscrossed her arms where flying debris had torn through her dress, and a purple bruise covered half her face where something heavy had struck her. Yet she had spent the night checking on the younger children, whispering comfort to those who cried out in their sleep, never once complaining about her own pain. "My name is Isatai Pieroa," he finally managed, keeping his voice gentle and low so as not to startle the others who were beginning to wake. "I am of the Comanche people, but I mean you no harm. The storm brought you to me, and I will protect you until we can find your families." Rebecca studied his face with the kind of intensity that Isatai had seen in seasoned warriors evaluating a potential ally or enemy. Despite her youth, this girl had been forced to make adult decisions in circumstances that would have broken many grown men. Now she was trying to determine whether this strange Indian who had rescued them could be trusted with the lives of 6 other children who depended on her judgment. "Our families," she said slowly, testing the words as if they might shatter like glass if spoken too loudly. "Do you think they're still alive?" It was the question Isatai had been dreading since the moment he pulled the first child from the wreckage. The storm that had nearly killed these 7 had been one of the worst he had ever witnessed, a monster of wind and dust that could have buried an entire wagon train without leaving a trace. But looking into Rebecca's eyes, seeing the desperate hope that she was trying so hard to hide, he could not bring himself to voice the doubts that gnawed at his own heart. "The storm was fierce, but your people are strong," he said carefully. "When the sun climbs higher and the air clears completely, we will search for them. Until then, we must focus on making you all healthy enough to be reunited with those who love you." As the other children awakened one by one, Isatai began to understand the true scope of the tragedy that had befallen the Cedar Creek wagon train. Each child who regained consciousness brought fragments of memory that, when pieced together, painted a picture of catastrophe almost beyond comprehension. The wagon train had consisted of 12 families, nearly 60 people in total, all bound for the Oregon Territory, where they hoped to claim land and build new lives far from the crowded cities of the East. Tommy, whose courage in the storm had impressed Izatai so deeply, was the first to speak of what he had witnessed before the families were scattered. "The wind came up so fast," he said, his young voice shaking with remembered terror. "One minute we could see for miles, and next it was like someone had pulled a blanket over the whole world. The animals went crazy first. Our oxen started bellowing and trying to break free from their traces, and the horses were rearing and screaming like they could smell death coming." Sarah, one of the twins, added her own piece to the terrible puzzle. "Papa tried to tie the wagons together in a circle like we practiced for Indian attacks, but the wind was too strong. It picked up our wagon and threw it like it was made of straw. I saw Mrs. Henderson flying through the air, and then everything went dark and I couldn't find Mary anywhere." Mary, her twin sister, had been sitting silently beside Sarah, but at the mention of her name she began to cry with the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from a well of grief too deep for such a small person to contain. "I saw Mama and Papa," she whispered through her tears. "They were trying to reach us when the big piece of wood hit them. There was blood, so much blood, and then the dust covered them up and I couldn't see them anymore. Benjamin, whose broken arm Izatai had splinted with strips of wood and torn cloth, spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone still in shock. My family's wagon was at the back of the train. When the storm hit, we tried to run to the others, but the wind was so loud we couldn't hear anything else. I saw my little sister Emma get picked up by the wind and carried away like a leaf. Ma was screaming her name, but then a wheel from somebody's wagon hit May in the head and she fell down and didn't get up again." James, the 10-year-old who had not spoken since the rescue, finally found his voice as the morning sun climbed higher in the canyon. But when he spoke, it was in a whisper so soft that Izatai had to lean close to hear him. "They're all dead," he said with the flat certainty of someone who had seen too much. "Every grown-up, every baby, every old person. The storm ate them all, and we're the only ones left because we're not important enough for the wind to want." The silence that followed James's words was more profound than any Izatai had ever experienced. These children, the youngest barely old enough to walk, had witnessed the destruction of their entire world in the space of a few hours. They had seen parents die, siblings disappear, and the familiar foundations of their lives torn apart by forces beyond human control or understanding. Now they sat in a strange canyon with a man whose people their families had taught them to fear, trying to comprehend a future that contained none of the certainties they had once taken for granted. But it was Rebecca who finally broke the crushing silence, her voice carrying a strength that reminded Izatai of the great war chiefs he had known, men who could face impossible odds without flinching. "Then we have to take care of each other," she said simply. "If the grown-ups are gone, then we're a family now. All of us. And families don't give up on each other, no matter what." Izatai felt something shift in his chest as he watched these 7 children, the oldest barely into her teens, instinctively forming the bonds that would sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. They had lost everything that children were supposed to be able to depend on, but instead of surrendering to despair, they were choosing to create something new from the ashes of their old lives. It was a kind of courage that humbled him completely. Once little David's fever broke and his breathing stabilized, Izatai knew he could no longer postpone the search that all of them needed, even though he dreaded what they might find. The children deserved to know the fate of their families, and the dead deserved proper burial according to both white and Indian customs. More practically, there might be supplies scattered in the wreckage that could help sustain them in the coming days. He left the 7 children in the sanctuary of the canyon with strict instructions to stay together and tend the fire, taking Only Thunder Walker and his rifle as he rode out to examine the devastation left by the storm. What he found in the broad valley where the wagon train had been caught exceeded even his worst expectations. The landscape looked as if a giant hand had reached down from the sky and stirred the earth like soup, leaving behind a chaos of broken wood, scattered belongings, and shapes that Izatai tried not to examine too closely. The wagons had been completely destroyed, reduced to splinters and twisted metal that lay half-buried in drifts of sand and debris. Personal belongings were scattered across miles of prairie, family photographs and children's toys lying, besides shattered furniture and torn clothing that would never again warm the bodies they had been made to protect. But it was the silence that struck Izatai most profoundly. In the aftermath of battle, there were always sounds: the groaning of wounded men and horses, the calls of those searching for survivors. Here there was nothing but the whisper of wind across empty land. He found the first body near what had once been the lead wagon, a man in his 30s whose face was peaceful despite the circumstances of his death. Izatai recognized him from Rebecca's description as Mr. Patterson, the wagon train leader who had guided these families across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory only to be killed within sight of their destination. Near him lay a woman who could only be his wife, her arms still wrapped protectively around a bundle that Izatai realized with sick certainty was their infant child. The search took most of the day, and with each discovery, Izatai's heart grew heavier. These had been good people, families who had risked everything for the chance to build better lives in a new land. Now they lay scattered across the prairie like broken dolls, their dreams buried under tons of dust and debris. He found evidence of 53 deaths in total, including 12 children under the age of 10. The 7 he had rescued were indeed the only survivors of what had been a thriving community just 24 hours earlier. But among the wreckage, Izatai also found things that would prove invaluable for keeping the children alive. Medical supplies from a doctor's bag, tools that had survived the destruction, preserved food that had been protected in sealed containers, and most importantly, a strong box containing money and documents that would prove the children's identities if they ever reached civilization again. He loaded everything useful onto Thunder Walker, trying not to think about the families who would never again need these possessions. As evening approached, Izatai faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The practical part of his mind knew that he should bury the dead according to white customs, creating graves with markers that would allow authorities to identify them later. But the spiritual part of his nature, the part that had been trained in Comanche beliefs about death and the journey of souls, rebelled against leaving these people in the place where they had died violently. Their spirits would never find peace in ground that had been watered with terror and blood. In the end, he chose a compromise that honored both traditions. Working through the night by moonlight, he gathered the bodies and arranged them in Araim through the night by moonlight, a sheltered valley where they would be protected from scavengers and the elements. He built a funeral pyre according to Comanche custom, sending their spirits to the afterlife with the smoke and flames that would carry their essence to whatever gods they had worshipped in life. As the fire burned, he sang the death songs his grandfather had taught him, offering prayers in Comanche and English for souls caught between two worlds. The flames lit up the night sky like a signal beacon, and Izatai knew that anyone within 20 miles would see the glow and understand that something significant had happened in this place. Whether that would bring help or trouble remained to be seen, but the dead deserved honor more than the living deserved safety. As the last embers died away and the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Izatai rode back toward the canyon where 7 children waited for news that would reshape their understanding of their place in the world. When Izatai returned to the canyon, he found the children arranged in a semicircle around the dying fire, their faces reflecting the kind of patience that comes from understanding that some conversations cannot be rushed. Rebecca sat in the center with little David, cradled in her lap, his fever finally broken, but his eyes still unfocused from the head injury that might affect him for the rest of his life. The others maintained the protective formation they had instinctively adopted, older children positioned to shield younger ones from whatever bad news their rescuer might bring. "You found them," Rebecca said, and it was not a question. Something in Azatai's expression, or perhaps in the way he dismounted from Thunder Walker, with the careful movements of someone who had spent hours handling the dead, had already told her everything she needed to know about the fate of their families. Azatai nodded slowly, settling cross-legged on the ground facing the children so that he could look each of them in the eye as he delivered news that would change the course of their lives forever. "I found them all," he said simply. "They died as they lived, protecting those they loved. Your parents fought the storm until their last breath, trying to save you. That is how they will be remembered." The silence that followed was not the crushing quiet of despair, but something deeper and more complex. These children had already suspected the truth during the long hours of waiting, and now that their worst fears were confirmed, they seemed almost relieved to finally know where they stood. The uncertainty that had tormented them was over, replaced by the cold clarity of complete loss. "So we're orphans now," Tommy said matter-of-factly, his 8-year-old voice carrying no self-pity, only the practical acceptance of changed circumstances. "What happens to orphans way out here where there's no orphanage or church people to take care of them?" It was the question that Azatai had been asking himself since the moment he decided to search for their families. These children were white settlers in Comanche territory, survivors of a tragedy that would probably be blamed on Indian attacks once word reached the nearest settlements. Taking them back to white civilization would mean delivering them to people who might view their rescue by a Comanche warrior with suspicion and hostility. But keeping them in his world would mean asking them to abandon everything familiar and embrace a way of life that their families had considered savage and dangerous. "That depends," Azatai said carefully, "on what you want to happen. I can try to take you to the nearest white settlement, where someone might agree to care for you until relatives can be found or arrangements can be made. Or you can stay with me, and I will teach you to survive in this land that has become your home whether you chose it or not." Rebecca looked around the circle of faces, reading expressions and unspoken fears with the intuitive wisdom of someone who had been thrust into leadership before she was ready for it. "What would staying with you mean?" she asked. "Would we have to become Indians? Would we have to forget our families and pretend to be something we're not?" Azatai considered his words carefully, knowing that whatever he said next would determine whether these 7 souls found a new home or faced years of uncertainty in a world that had little patience for inconvenient orphans. "You would learn Comanche ways because they are the ways that keep people alive on these plains," he said finally. "But you would also keep the good things your families taught you, the songs your mothers sang and the stories your fathers told. A person can be more than one thing at the same time without losing what makes them who they are." Mary, the twin who had seen her parents die, spoke up with a voice that trembled but did not break. "Would you really want us? 7 white children who don't know anything about being Indian? We'd just be a burden, and you don't owe us anything." The question hit Azatai with unexpected force, bringing back memories of his own desperate prayers for children and the empty years of longing that had followed Ayana's death. These 7 had been brought to him by the same storm that had taken everything else from their lives, delivered into his care by forces beyond human understanding or control. If that was not the hand of the Great Spirit at work, then nothing in the world made sense. "The spirits gave me 7 years of waiting for children who never came," he said, his voice rough with emotion he had not expected to feel. "Then they sent the fiercest storm I have ever seen to bring me 7 children who needed someone to choose them. If that is not the answer to prayer, then I have never understood how the universe works." Benjamin, whose broken arm was healing but would probably never be quite straight again, looked up from where he'd been staring at the ground. You really think the spirits meant for this to happen? All those people dying just so we could find someone to take care of us? Izatai shook his head slowly. I think the spirits grieve for every life lost, just as we do. But I also think they can create something beautiful from even the most terrible circumstances, if we have the courage to let them. Your families loved you enough to cross a continent for your sake. Maybe this is their love still protecting you, making sure you found someone who would choose to love you even though you are not his blood. The sun was setting over the canyon rim, painting the rock walls in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Izatai of the sacred fires his people lit to honor important decisions. 7 children sat in the growing darkness, each wrestling with choices that no child should have to make. But when Rebecca finally spoke for all of them, her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then we choose you too, she said simply. We choose to be your children, if you'll have us. We choose to learn your ways and honor our families by surviving instead of giving up. We choose to trust that the spirits brought us together for reasons we might not understand until we're old enough to see the whole pattern. As the first stars appeared overhead and the canyon filled with the peaceful sounds of evening, Esitetechiaroa looked at the 7 faces surrounding him and felt his heart expand to accommodate loves he had never imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and the difficult work of forging a family from the survivors of catastrophe. But tonight, in this sacred place where ancient spirits had watched over his people for countless generations, he was no longer a man whose prayers had gone unanswered. He was a father, chosen by children who had lost everything and decided to trust him with their futures anyway. 3 days after the children chose to become his family, Izatai discovered that some decisions echo across the plains like war drums, carrying messages to ears that were never meant to hear them. He was teaching Rebecca and Tommy how to identify edible plants near the canyon spring when Thunder Walker's ears pricked forward with the alertness that had saved Izatai's life in countless battles. The horse was staring toward the canyon entrance, nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made his war-trained instincts flare to life. Izatai dropped to a crouch, motioning for the children to stay low and silent. In the distance, barely audible above the whisper of wind through stone, came the sound that every plains dweller learned to recognize and fear. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving at a steady pace that spoke of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find when they arrived. But these were not the unshod ponies of Izatai's people, whose hooves made soft thunder on grass and earth. These were the sharp, metallic sounds of iron horseshoes striking rock, the signature of white men who rode with purpose and firepower. Stay with the others, Izatai whispered to Rebecca, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even brave 14-year-olds obey without question. Keep them quiet and hidden until I return. If something happens to me, take them deeper into the canyon to the place I showed you yesterday. There is water there, and caves where you can hide until help comes. Rebecca's eyes went wide with the kind of fear that comes from understanding that safety was always temporary for people like them. Who is it? What do they want? Izatai checked his rifle and the knife at his belt, his movements automatic from years of preparing for conflicts he hoped would never come. The funeral pyre I built for your families burned bright enough to be seen for many miles. Someone has come to investigate what happened to the wagon train, and they may not be pleased to discover that the only survivors are in the care of a Comanche warrior. He made his way through the narrow passages that led to the canyon entrance, moving with the silent grace that had made him one of the most respected scouts in his band. The approaching riders were still half a mile away, but Izatai could already count them by the rhythm of their hoofbeats. 7 men, riding in the loose formation that soldiers used when they expected trouble, but were not yet ready to fight. At this distance, he could not tell if they wore the blue uniforms of cavalry or the mixed clothing of civilian militia. But their numbers and organization suggested official authority rather than random travelers, from his concealed position. Behind a boulder near the canyon mouth, Izatai studied the approaching party through the gap between two rock formations. 7 riders as he had calculated, but their appearance made his blood run cold with recognition and dread. These were not regular army soldiers or territorial militia. They wore the distinctive gray uniforms and campaign hats of the Texas Rangers, the elite force that had earned a reputation for ruthless efficiency in dealing with Indian raids and frontier violence. And leading them was a man whose face Izatai recognized from wanted posters and campfire stories told in hushed, fearful voices: Captain Ezra Blackwood, the most feared ranger captain on the Texas frontier. A man who had built his reputation on the systematic destruction of Comanche war parties, who was said to have personally killed more than 50 Indian warriors in battles that had become legends among both whites and natives. Blackwood was known for his absolute refusal to take prisoners, his belief that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, and his talent for tracking quarry across terrain that would defeat lesser men. If he had come looking for the survivors of the wagon train, it meant that someone with serious authority wanted answers about what had happened in that valley. As the Rangers drew closer, Izatai could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the wind. Blackwood's voice was unmistakable, a gravelly rasp that spoke of years spent shouting orders over the noise of battle and breathing dust on long campaigns. The funeral pyre was definitely Indian work, he was saying to one of his men. Too organized for scavengers, too respectful for a war party. Someone took time to honor the dead, which means someone was here long enough to care about proper burial. Could be friendly Indians, Captain, suggested another voice, younger and less certain. Maybe they found the bodies after the storm and did right by them out of respect. Blackwood's laugh was like the sound of metal scraping against stone. Boy, there ain't no such thing as friendly Indians when white families are dead and children are missing. Either those kids are buried under all that dust we saw, or someone took them. And if someone took them, we're looking at the biggest Indian raid in Texas history, disguised as a natural disaster. Izatai felt his jaw clench as he understood the terrible logic that had brought these dangerous men to his sanctuary. The storm had destroyed all evidence of what had really happened to the wagon train, leaving only the funeral pyre as proof that someone had been present after the deaths occurred. To men like Blackwood, who saw every interaction between whites and Indians through the lens of warfare, the respectful burial of white settlers could only mean one thing. Indians had been responsible for their deaths and had taken their children as captives, following patterns that had played out dozens of times across the frontier. The Rangers dismounted near the canyon entrance, their movements efficient and professional as they prepared to investigate the narrow passage that led to Izatai's hiding place. Blackwood assigned 2 men to watch the horses while the others formed a loose skirmish line that would allow them to advance through the canyon while maintaining fields of fire in multiple directions. These were not amateur Indian fighters but seasoned professionals, who had survived years of warfare by never underestimating their enemies. As the first ranger entered the canyon mouth with his rifle at the ready, Izatai faced a decision that would determine whether his new family lived to see another sunset. He could try to remain hidden, hoping that the Rangers would find no trace of the children and eventually give up their search. But the canyon was not large enough to hide 7 children indefinitely, and men like Blackwood were trained to find sign that others would miss. If they discovered the children, they would assume the worst about Izatai's intentions and react accordingly, or he could reveal himself now before the Rangers found the children and try to explain what had really happened during the storm. It was a desperate gamble that would put him at the mercy of men who had never shown mercy to any Comanche warrior. But it might be the only chance to protect 7 innocent lives from becoming casualties in a war they had never chosen to join. Izatai stepped out from behind his boulder with his hands raised, his rifle held high in the universal gesture of temporary peace. The effect on the Rangers was immediate and dramatic. 5 weapons swung toward him with the smooth precision of men who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, fingers tightening on triggers as they evaluated whether to kill him immediately or take the time to ask questions first. "Hold. Your fire," Blackwood commanded, though his own revolver remained pointed steadily at Izatai's chest. "Let's see what this buck has to say for himself before we send him to join his ancestors." Izatai stood perfectly still, knowing that any sudden movement would result in his death and leave 7 children to face these men without protection. "I am Izatai Piaroa of the Nokoni Comanche," he said in English that was fluid enough to surprise the Rangers, who were accustomed to communicating with Indians through interpreters or sign language. "I come in peace to speak of the children who survived the great storm." The mention of surviving children sent a visible ripple of tension through the Ranger ranks. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he processed this information, his mind clearly racing through the implications of what he had just heard. "What children, Indian? And what do you know about what happened to that wagon train?" "I know that the storm killed 53 people in less than 4 hours," Izatai replied carefully, keeping his voice steady despite the multiple guns trained on his vital organs. "I know that 7 children survived, because the spirits guided me to them before the dust could claim their lives. And I know that they are alive and safe, because I chose to save them rather than let them die." One of the younger Rangers, a man who looked barely old enough to grow a proper mustache, shifted nervously as he tried to reconcile Izatai's words with everything he had been taught about Indian behavior. "Captain, if he's telling the truth about saving white children, he's lying," Blackwood cut him off with absolute certainty. "Indians don't risk their lives to save white children unless they plan to sell them as slaves or use them for leverage. This buck probably helped orchestrate the whole attack, then stuck around to loot the bodies and collect any survivors for the slave markets." Izatai felt anger flare in his chest at the casual dismissal of his motives, but he forced himself to remain calm. These men operated from a worldview that made genuine compassion between races impossible to imagine. To them, every Indian action had to be motivated by greed, violence, or strategic advantage. The idea that a Comanche warrior might risk his life to save white children out of simple human decency was literally unthinkable. "The children can speak for themselves," Izatai said, playing his only remaining card. "They will tell you that I found them dying in the storm, that I gave them shelter and food and medicine, that I searched for their families and honored their dead, according to both white and Indian customs. They will tell you that I offered to take them to white settlements, but they chose to stay with me because they trust me to protect them." Blackwood's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching amusement, as if Izatai had just told an particularly entertaining joke. "You expect me to believe that white children would choose to stay with a murdering savage instead of returning to civilization? Boy, you must think we just fell off the turnip wagon." But before Izatai could respond, a new voice cut across the canyon like a blade through silk. "He's telling the truth," Rebecca called out as she emerged from the narrow passage that led deeper into the canyon, her chin raised with the kind of defiance that reminded Izatai why he had come to love this brave girl so deeply. "Izatai Piaroa saved our lives when no one else could, and we're staying with him because he's the only father we have left." The appearance of a white teenage girl defending an Indian warrior left the Rangers speechless for several heartbeats. Blackwood's revolver wavered slightly as his mind struggled to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about frontier warfare. Behind Rebecca, the other children began to emerge one by one, forming a protective line. Between Izatai and the men who had come to rescue them from their supposed captivity, Tommy stepped forward with the kind of courage that made grown men ashamed of their own fears. "The storm killed our families," he said in his clear 8-year-old voice. "Izatai found us buried in the dust and carried us to safety. He could have left us to die, but he didn't. He's been taking care of us for 3 days, teaching us how to survive and treating us like we were his own children. The children are obviously confused, Blackwood said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. They've been traumatized by their experience and don't understand the danger they're in. Indians are skilled at manipulating captives, making them think their captors are protectors. It's a common tactic used to prevent escape attempts, but Sarah, one of the twins, shook her head with the kind of stubborn determination that made her mother's Irish heritage unmistakable. "We're not confused, and we're not captives," she declared. "Isatai saved us when our own people couldn't. He searched for our ma and pa even though it was dangerous, and when he found them dead, he buried them proper and said prayers over their graves. A bad man wouldn't do that." The standoff continued for long minutes as both sides evaluated their options and tried to determine how the situation might be resolved without bloodshed. Isatai could see the internal struggle playing out on Blackwood's weathered face as the ranger captain tried to reconcile his preconceptions about Indian behavior with the clear evidence of 7 white children voluntarily defending their supposed captor. The other rangers looked to their leader for guidance, their weapons still ready but their certainty beginning to waver. Finally, Blackwood made a decision that revealed both his pragmatic nature and his fundamental inability to trust any Indian under any circumstances. "Here's what's going to happen," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We're taking these children back to Fort Richardson where they can receive proper care and be placed with Christian families who will raise them according to civilized standards. The Indian can come along peacefully, and we'll let a military tribunal sort out his role in this affair." "No," Rebecca said with quiet firmness that made the word ring like a bell across the canyon. "We're not going anywhere with you. Isatai is our family now, and families stick together." Blackwood's face darkened with the kind of anger that came from having his authority challenged by someone he viewed as both inferior and ungrateful. "Little girl, you don't get to choose. You're white children in Indian hands, which makes this a matter of territorial security. We have orders to recover any survivors and neutralize any threats to settler safety in this region." The subtle shift in Blackwood's language did not escape Isatai's notice. The ranger captain had moved from discussing rescue to talking about neutralizing threats, military terminology that suggested he had already decided how this encounter was going to end. Isatai began calculating distances and angles, evaluating his chances of reaching the children and getting them to cover before the shooting started. But it was Benjamin, the 12-year-old with the broken arm, who escalated the situation beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. "You're not taking us anywhere," he said, stepping protectively in front of little David, whose head injury still left him unsteady on his feet. "Our real families are dead, and Isatai is the only one who cared enough to save us when we were dying. If you try to take us away from him, you're just as bad as the storm that killed our parents." The comparison between the Rangers and the natural disaster that had destroyed the wagon train was apparently more than Blackwood's pride could tolerate. His hand moved toward his gun with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had drawn on dozens of opponents and never lost. "That's enough sass from ungrateful children who don't know what's good for them," he snarled. "Boys, we're taking these kids back to civilization whether they like it or not. And if the Indian gives us any trouble, we'll handle him the same way we've handled every other murdering savage who's crossed our path." The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. 7 children and 1 Comanche warrior, facing 7 armed rangers in a narrow canyon where escape was impossible and surrender meant separation or death. Isatai could feel the weight of his rifle in his hands, could sense the precise positions of each enemy weapon, could calculate the odds of survival for each member of his adopted family if violence erupted in the next few seconds. Then Mary, the 6-year-old twin who had seen her parents die in the storm, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady as granite. "Please don't hurt our papa," she said to Blackwood, using the Comanche word for father that Isatai had taught them. "He's the only papa we have left, and we love him more than anything in the whole world." The child's use of the Comanche word for father hit the Rangers like a physical blow, confirming their worst fears about what these innocent white children were being transformed into under Indian influence. To men like Blackwood, who viewed the conflict between white and Indian cultures as a zero-sum war for the soul of the frontier, the sight of white children adopting Indian words and customs represented a kind of spiritual contamination that could not be tolerated. "That settles it," Blackwood declared, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "These children have been corrupted by prolonged exposure to savage influence. They need immediate removal to proper Christian care before the damage becomes permanent. And this Indian needs to answer for his crimes against innocent families." Isatai saw the moment when words stopped mattering and violence became inevitable. Blackwood's hand was moving toward his weapon. His men were shifting into firing positions, and the children were standing in the exact wrong place to survive the crossfire that was about to erupt. Time slowed to the strange crystalline clarity that Isatai had experienced in dozens of battles, each heartbeat stretching into eternity as he made calculations that would determine who lived and who died in the next few seconds. "Children, down," he commanded in Comanche, knowing that the language barrier might buy him a crucial fraction of a second as the Rangers tried to interpret his words. Rebecca understood immediately, tackling Mary and Sarah to the ground while Tommy grabbed Benjamin and David, pulling them behind a boulder that would provide minimal cover from the coming storm of bullets. Isatai's rifle came up with the smooth efficiency of muscle memory trained through years of warfare, his finger finding the trigger as he chose his first target. Not Blackwood, whose death would make martyrs of all of them, but the young ranger on the right whose nervousness made him the most likely to start shooting wildly and hit one of the children by accident. The shot would have to be perfect, a killing blow that removed one threat while using the muzzle flash and smoke to mask his movement toward better cover. But before either side could fire the shots that would turn the narrow canyon into a charnel house, a new sound echoed off the stone walls with the force of thunder rolling across the plains. Hoofbeats again, but these were different from the shod horses of the Rangers. These were the soft, rapid sounds of unshod ponies ridden by men who had learned to become one with their mounts, accompanied by the distinctive war cries that had struck fear into frontier settlements for generations. A Comanche war party was approaching at full gallop, drawn by the sound of voices echoing through stone passages that carried sound for miles across the empty plains. Isatai felt his heart sink as he realized that the situation had just escalated beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. The arrival of his own people meant that what had been a tense standoff between one Indian and 7 Rangers was about to become a full-scale battle between two forces that had been killing each other for decades. "Ambush!" Blackwood shouted, all thoughts of the children forgotten as his military training took over. "Defensive positions, boys. We've got hostiles incoming." The Rangers scattered with professional efficiency, using the canyon walls and scattered boulders to create interlocking fields of fire that would turn the narrow passage into a killing ground for any attacking force. But Isatai knew these tactics would be useless against Comanche warriors who had spent their entire lives learning to fight in terrain exactly like this. His people would scale the canyon walls, attack from multiple directions, and use their superior numbers and mobility to overwhelm the Rangers' defensive positions, which meant that 7 innocent children were about to be caught in the crossfire between two groups of armed men who viewed each other as mortal enemies. The very people Isatai had hoped might help protect his new family were now the greatest threat to their survival. And somewhere in the approaching thunder of hoofbeats, Isatai could hear the voice of his old friend Chief Horseback shouting war cries that promised death to any white man found in Comanche territory. As the first arrows began to whistle through the air, and the crack of rifle fire echoed off the canyon walls, Isatai threw himself over the children he had sworn to protect, using his own body as a shield against the violence that was about to consume them all. The storm that had brought them together had been terrible, but the storm of human hatred and fear that was about to break over their heads might destroy everything they had built from the ashes of tragedy in that moment, as bullets and arrows filled the air above their heads and the war cries of his own people mixed with the shouts of dying rangers. Isatai understood that saving 7 children from a dust storm had been only the beginning of their trials. The real test of whether love could triumph over hatred, whether chosen families could survive in a world determined to tear them apart, was just beginning. The first arrow that whistled through the canyon air came from Isatai's closest childhood friend, a warrior named Swift Eagle whose aim had never failed in 20 years of warfare. The arrow buried itself in the chest of the youngest ranger with a wet thud that echoed off the stone walls like a death knell. The boy dropped without a sound, his unfired rifle clattering against the rocks as his life bled out onto ground that had witnessed too much violence already. "Chief Horseback, stop!" Isatai shouted in Comanche, rising from where he had been shielding the children to wave both arms above his head in the universal signal for parley. "These children are under my protection. They are innocent of any wrongdoing." But his words were lost in the chaos of battle as 15 Comanche warriors poured into the canyon like a flood of vengeance given human form. Chief Horseback led the charge on his magnificent black stallion, his face painted for war, and his lance decorated with the scalps of enemies who had underestimated his tactical brilliance. Behind him rode the finest fighters of their band, men who had followed Isatai into countless battles and would follow him into the spirit world itself if he asked. Now they were trying to kill him to save him from what they believed was a ranger trap. The surviving rangers opened fire with disciplined volleys that spoke of years spent fighting Plains Indians, their bullets finding targets with deadly precision despite the confusion and poor light. 2 Comanche warriors fell from their ponies in the first exchange, one clutching a shattered shoulder while the other lay still against the canyon wall. But the warriors adapted quickly, abandoning their horses and flowing up the stone walls like water finding cracks in a dam. Captain Blackwood's voice rose above the din of battle as he tried to coordinate his men's defense while simultaneously keeping track of Isatai and the children. "Richardson, watch the Indian with the kids. If he tries anything, put him down permanent. Jenkins, cover the left approach. These savages are trying to flank us." Isatai found himself in the impossible position of being caught between 2 forces that viewed him as an enemy despite his attempts to prevent the very conflict that was now consuming them all. To the Rangers, he was a hostile Indian who had probably orchestrated the attack on the wagon train. To his own people, he was a warrior who had been captured or coerced by white soldiers and needed to be rescued at any cost. "Papa, what's happening?" Rebecca's voice cut through the noise of warfare like a knife through his heart. She was crouched behind the boulder where he had placed the children, her arms wrapped protectively around little David while the other children huddled against her like baby birds seeking shelter from a storm. "Why are your people trying to hurt us?" The question revealed the tragic irony of their situation with crystalline clarity. These children had chosen to become Comanche, had embraced Isatai as their father and accepted his people as their extended family. But the warriors who had come to rescue them saw only white faces that represented generations of warfare and betrayal. The cultural transformation that had seemed so natural in the peaceful sanctuary of the hidden canyon meant nothing in the heat of battle where friend and foe were determined by the color of skin rather than the content of hearts. Swift Eagle appeared at the top of the canyon wall like an avenging spirit, his bow drawn and an arrow nocked as he searched for targets among the rangers below. When his eyes found Isatai standing over the white children, His expression shifted from determination to confusion, and then to something approaching horror. This was not the rescue scenario he had envisioned when Chief Horseback had spotted the smoke from the funeral pyre and organized the war party. "Brother," Swift Eagle called down in Comanche, his voice carrying a note of desperate confusion. "Step away from the white children so we can finish these rangers and get you to safety. You have been held captive long enough." Isatai looked up at his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him during his wedding ceremony and helped him bury Ayana when grief had made him too weak to function. "These children are not my captives," he shouted back, knowing that every word he spoke was being heard by rangers who were looking for any excuse to start shooting again. "They are my family now. I adopted them after the storm killed their parents, and I will die before I let anyone harm them." The declaration hit both sides like a thunderbolt, confirming the worst fears of each group while simultaneously revealing the depth of Isatai's commitment to his new role as protector. The Rangers now knew for certain that he had not been coerced or captured, that his defense of the children was genuine and would continue until death. The Comanche warriors understood that their brother had chosen to align himself with white settlers against his own people, a betrayal that demanded explanation, if not outright vengeance. Chief Horseback emerged from cover near the canyon entrance, his powerful voice carrying the authority of a man who had led successful raids against 3 different cavalry units. "Isatai Piaroa, you speak words that cut my heart like enemy blades," he called out, his tone mixing disappointment with genuine grief. "These white children are the offspring of people who would see every Comanche dead or driven from our ancestral lands. How can you claim them as family when their very existence represents everything our people have fought against?" The question forced Isatai to articulate beliefs he had barely acknowledged to himself during the peaceful days in the canyon, when the outside world had seemed impossibly distant. "Because they are children," he replied, his voice carrying across the battle-torn canyon with the force of absolute conviction. "Because they were dying, and I could save them. Because the spirits brought them to me when my own heart was dead with grief, and loving them brought me back to life. Because family is not about blood or race or the sins of parents, but about choosing to protect those who need protection." Captain Blackwood, who had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding of just how complicated the situation had become, suddenly saw an opportunity to turn the Indians' internal conflict to his advantage. "Boys, hold your fire," he commanded his surviving rangers. "Let these savages sort out their own problems while we figure out how to get those children to safety." But Swift Eagle had heard enough. To him, Isatai's words represented not enlightenment, but madness, the kind of thinking that led to the destruction of entire tribes when warriors forgot that survival depended on maintaining clear distinctions between us and them. "Brother, grief has made you forget who you are," he called down with the patience of someone addressing a beloved relative who had lost his mind. "These white children will grow up to be white adults who will kill Comanche babies and steal Comanche land. Saving them today means dooming our own children tomorrow. Then our children will have to be stronger and wiser than we are," Isatai replied without hesitation. "They will have to build a world where Comanche children and white children can grow up together instead of growing up to kill each other. These 7 will be the first generation to try living that way, and I will give them that chance no matter what it costs." The philosophical debate between 2 old friends was interrupted by the sharp crack of a rifle as one of the rangers, apparently deciding that the Indians had been allowed to talk long enough, took a shot at Chief Horseback. The bullet gouged a furrow in the rock inches from the war chief's head, sending chips of stone flying like deadly rain. The tenuous ceasefire shattered instantly as both sides resumed the business of killing with renewed fury, but this time, the dynamic of the battle had changed in ways that made victory impossible for anyone involved. The Comanche warriors found themselves reluctant to fire at Isatai, even though he stood with the enemy, because he was still their brother regardless of his inexplicable choices. the Rangers discovered that they could not effectively target the Indians without risking shots that might hit the children they had come to rescue. And Isatai was forced to defend white children against his own people, while simultaneously protecting them from Rangers who viewed him as an enemy. The result was a chaotic melee where traditional battle lines meant nothing, and every shot fired carried the risk of hitting the wrong target. Swift Eagle found himself torn between his duty to rescue his friend and his growing realization that Isatai genuinely did not want to be rescued. Chief Horseback watched in growing horror as the battle he had initiated to save one Comanche warrior was tearing apart the unity that had sustained their band through decades of warfare. The Rangers struggled to maintain their defensive positions while protecting children who seemed determined to stay with their Indian captor. In the midst of the confusion, little Tommy made a decision that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Seeing that one of the wounded Rangers was trying to crawl toward better cover while bleeding heavily from a leg wound, the 8-year-old broke away from Rebecca's protective embrace and ran toward the injured man with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. "Mister, you're hurt," he called out in his clear young voice. "Let me help you stop the bleeding." The sight of a white child voluntarily helping a wounded Ranger, while Comanche arrows whistled overhead, created a moment of such cognitive dissonance that fighters on both sides simply stopped shooting and stared. Swift Eagle lowered his bow as he tried to process what he was seeing. Captain Blackwood forgot to reload his revolver as he watched a boy who should have been terrified of Indians, calmly tending to a wounded soldier while trusting his Indian protector to keep him safe. "That child has been taught Comanche healing ways," Chief Horseback observed with something approaching wonder in his voice. "See how he uses pressure and elevation to control the bleeding. Someone has been training him in the warrior's medicine." Rebecca, who had been trying to keep the other children safe behind their boulder, made her own choice about where her loyalty belonged. "I'm going to help Tommy," she announced to No one in particular, then stood up and walked into the open area where bullets had been flying just moments before. "If anyone shoots at me or Tommy while we're helping wounded people, they're going to have to explain to God why they killed children who were trying to save lives." Her words carried across the canyon with the moral authority that only the truly innocent could command. And suddenly the idea of resuming the battle seemed not just tactically difficult, but spiritually impossible. Warriors who had never hesitated to kill enemy soldiers found themselves unable to shoot at a teenage girl who was kneeling beside their friend, helping him treat injured Rangers with techniques their own medicine men had taught them. The impromptu medical assistance created a bubble of peace in the center of a war zone, but Isatai knew it could not last. Eventually, someone would remember that they were supposed to be enemies, that generations of hatred could not be overcome by the sight of children transcending the boundaries their elders had created. He had to act quickly while the moment of grace still held both sides in its spell. "Chief Horseback," he called out, stepping into the open ground between the two forces with his hands raised but his voice carrying the authority of a respected war leader. "I ask for the right to speak under the ancient laws of parley. Give me the chance to explain my actions before more blood is spilled on ground that should be sacred to all peoples." The request invoked traditions older than the current conflict, protocols that even the fiercest warriors were bound to honor when invoked by a man of proven courage. Chief Horseback nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled by the choices his old friend had made. "Speak then, Isatai Pieroa. But speak quickly, for my warriors grow restless, and the white soldiers will not honor our customs much longer." Isatai looked around the canyon at faces painted for war, at children who had chosen to risk their lives helping wounded enemies, at Rangers whose worldview was being shattered by evidence that contradicted everything they thought they knew about Indian behavior. "3 days ago, I was a man waiting to die," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet air. "My wife was dead, my hope for children was buried with her, and I rode the plains looking for a place to rest my bones. beside hers. Then the spirits sent me a storm that would have killed these 7 children if I had not chosen to save them instead of letting death claim us all. He gestured toward Rebecca and Tommy, who were still tending to the wounded ranger with the kind of careful attention that spoke of genuine training and natural compassion. Look at them. See how they have learned our ways of healing, our respect for all life, our understanding that strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. These children have become Comanche in their hearts while remaining white in their blood. They represent something new, something that could bridge the gap between our peoples if we have the courage to let them try. Captain Blackwood, who had been listening with the attention of a man trying to solve a puzzle that defied conventional logic, finally spoke up. You're talking about white children raised as Indians. That's not bridging anything. That's just making more enemies for both sides to worry about. No, Isatai replied with the certainty of a man who had seen the future in 7 faces gathered around a fire. I am talking about children who understand that people are people regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak. Children who will grow up knowing that Comanche wisdom and white knowledge can exist in the same heart, that courage and compassion are not the property of any single race or tribe. Swift Eagle, who had been struggling with his own doubts about the necessity of the battle, slowly climbed down from his position on the canyon wall. And what happens when these children grow up? He asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than hostility. Do they become white adults who remember their Comanche childhood with fondness while they vote to drive us from our lands? Or do they become Indian adults who can never be accepted by either world? The question cut to the heart of the impossible choice that faced anyone who tried to live between 2 cultures that viewed each other as mortal enemies. But as Isatai looked at his 7 children, he saw not the seeds of future conflict but the first green shoots of a different kind of harvest altogether. They become something new, he said simply. Something that has never existed before. Because no one has ever been brave enough to try creating it. They become the bridge between worlds that everyone says is impossible, but no one has ever attempted to build. The fragile peace that had descended over the canyon shattered like thin ice when a new sound echoed from beyond the stone walls. Cavalry bugles, clear and sharp in the desert air, announcing the approach of at least 2 full companies of soldiers. Captain Blackwood's face went pale as he recognized the call signs that meant reinforcements were arriving much sooner than he had planned. He had requested backup, but not the overwhelming force that was now thundering toward their position. That's Colonel Morrison's cavalry, Blackwood said grimly, checking his ammunition with the automatic movements of a professional soldier. He's got orders to clear this region of hostile Indians using whatever force necessary. If he finds us in the middle of a firefight with Comanche warriors, he's going to assume the worst and start shooting everything that moves, Chief Horseback's expression hardened as he understood the implications of the approaching cavalry. His 15 warriors might be able to handle 7 rangers in a fair fight, but against 2 companies of mounted soldiers with repeating rifles and artillery support, they would be slaughtered like buffalo in a hunting pen. More importantly, the children who had somehow become the center of this conflict would be caught in a massacre that would leave no survivors to tell the true story of what had happened here. How long before they arrive? Swift Eagle asked, his warriors' instincts already calculating escape routes and defensive positions that might buy them precious minutes. Blackwood listened to the approaching hoofbeats with the trained ear of a man who had spent his life gauging military movements. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if they're being cautious about potential ambushes. Not long enough to get clear of this canyon, especially with wounded men on both sides. Isatai looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing the same realization dawning in every pair of eyes. Rangers and Comanche warriors, children and battle-hardened fighters, all of them trapped in a narrow canyon with a superior force approaching that would view anyone present as an enemy to be eliminated. The philosophical differences that had been tearing them, Apart moments earlier suddenly seemed trivial compared to the immediate threat of annihilation. "We have to work together," Rebecca said with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes from those too young to understand why cooperation should be impossible. "The soldiers don't know about Izatai saving us, or about how we chose to be his family. They'll just see Indians and Rangers fighting over white children, and they'll kill everyone to sort it out later." The alliance that formed in the next few minutes would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances. Rangers who had dedicated their lives to killing Indians found themselves accepting tactical advice from Comanche warriors who had been trying to scalp them moments earlier. Comanche fighters who viewed all white men as invaders began coordinating defensive positions with soldiers whose uniforms represented everything they had fought against for decades. Chief Horseback took command of the situation with the natural authority of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "The canyon has 3 possible escape routes," he announced, pointing to narrow passages that only someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain would have noticed. "The main entrance is blocked by the approaching cavalry, but there are 2 side passages that lead to different parts of the plateau above." Captain Blackwood studied the routes with professional interest, his prejudices temporarily set aside, in favor of survival instincts. "Can those passages handle wounded men and children? Some of my boys took serious hits, and at least 2 of your warriors need medical attention." "The north passage is too narrow and steep," Swift Eagle replied, his voice carrying none of the hostility that had marked their earlier interactions. "But the south route follows an old game trail that should be manageable if we support the wounded and move carefully." Izatai found himself in the surreal position of coordinating between 2 groups that had been mortal enemies minutes earlier, translating not just languages but entire worldviews as rangers and warriors struggled to communicate about tactics and timing. "The children can help carry supplies and guide the wounded," he suggested, knowing that their small size would be an advantage in the narrow passages. "They have been learning Comanche ways of moving silently through difficult terrain." The evacuation began with desperate efficiency as both sides worked to save lives rather than take them. Tommy and Benjamin helped splint the broken arm of a young ranger who had taken an arrow through his elbow, while Mary and Sarah gathered scattered ammunition and medical supplies with the methodical thoroughness their mother had taught them. Rebecca organized the movement of wounded warriors with the same calm authority she had shown during the storm. Treating Apache fighters and Texas Rangers with equal compassion, the first cavalry scouts appeared at the canyon entrance just as the last of the wounded were being evacuated through the South Passage. Colonel Morrison himself rode at the head of the advance party, his weathered face grim with the kind of determination that had made him the most feared Indian fighter on the frontier. When he saw the evidence of recent battle scattered across the canyon floor, his expression shifted to something approaching rage. "Captain Blackwood," he called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls with parade ground authority. "Report. Your status immediately. Have you secured the white children who were reported missing from the wagon train massacre?" Blackwood emerged from his concealed position near the canyon wall, knowing that his next words would determine whether the fragile alliance he had just formed would survive the next few minutes. "Colonel, the situation is more complicated than our initial report suggested. The children are safe, but they are not captives in the conventional sense." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he processed this information, his hand moving instinctively toward the saber at his side. "Explain yourself, Captain. Are you telling me that white children are voluntarily remaining with hostile Indians? That's impossible unless they have been subjected to severe psychological manipulation." Behind him, 2 full companies of cavalry began filing into the canyon with weapons ready, their numbers turning the narrow space into a potential killing ground where any resistance would be suicidal. The Rangers and Comanche warriors who had stayed behind to cover the evacuation found themselves facing overwhelming odds with no possibility of escape or victory. But then Tommy's voice rang out from somewhere high above them, clear and strong in the desert air. "Colonel Morrison, sir," the 8-year-old called down from his position in the South Passage. "Please don't hurt our papa or his friends. They saved us from the storm when our real families died, and now they're our family. We're not captives, we're children who found a new home." The colonel's head snapped up as he tried to locate the source of the voice, his tactical mind struggling to process the implications of what he had just heard. "Who is speaking?" "Show yourself immediately." Rebecca appeared at the edge of the passage, her young face visible against the rock face as she looked down at the armed soldiers below. "We're the survivors of the Cedar Creek wagon train, sir. Isatai Piaroa of the Comanche people saved our lives when the dust storm killed our parents. He's been taking care of us for days, teaching us how to survive and treating us like his own children. The Rangers came to rescue us, but we don't want to be rescued from the only family we have left." Colonel Morrison stared up at the girl with the kind of expression that comes from having fundamental assumptions challenged by undeniable evidence. In his 30 years of military service, he had never encountered a situation where white children voluntarily defended Indian captors, especially with such eloquence and obvious sincerity. Every protocol he had been trained to follow assumed that captives would want to be rescued, that children would prefer civilization to savagery. "Colonel," Captain Blackwood said carefully, stepping forward with his hands visible and non-threatening, "I believe these children are telling the truth. The Indian warrior Isatai appears to have genuinely saved them from certain death, and they have formed a family bond that goes beyond conventional understanding." Morrison's face darkened with the kind of anger that comes from being forced to question deeply held beliefs. "Captain, you are suggesting that I allow white children to remain with Indians who are technically enemy combatants. That is not just against regulations. It is against every principle that guides our mission in this territory." But before anyone could respond, Chief Horseback emerged from the shadows near the canyon wall with his hands raised in the universal gesture of parley. "Colonel Morrison," he said in careful English that surprised everyone present, "I know your reputation as an honorable warrior who keeps his word when it is given. I propose a solution that honors both your duty and the wishes of these children, who have chosen to build a bridge between our worlds." The Comanche chief's unexpected fluency in English and his reference to honor and duty caught Morrison off guard, forcing him to evaluate the situation as a negotiation between equals rather than a simple military operation. "I'm listening," he said cautiously, "but understand that I have orders regarding hostile Indians in this territory, and those orders do not include diplomatic discussions. Then let us make this a family matter rather than a military one." Chief Horseback replied with the wisdom of a leader who had survived decades of warfare by knowing when to fight and when to talk. "Isatai Piaroa is my brother by blood and choice. These children are now his children by adoption and their own decision. If you can accept that family bonds transcend the boundaries that divide our peoples, then perhaps we can find a path that serves justice without requiring bloodshed." Morrison looked up at the children, watching from the passage above, then at the mixed group of Rangers and Comanche warriors who had somehow found common ground in protecting innocent lives. For the first time in his military career, he was being asked to choose between following orders and following his conscience, between maintaining the divisions that had always defined frontier conflict and acknowledging the possibility that those divisions might not be absolute. "Stand down your weapons," he finally commanded his cavalry, the words coming out slowly as if he was still surprised to hear himself saying them. "We're going to sort this out with words instead of bullets, and see if there's a way to honor everyone's truth without betraying anyone's duty." 6 months after the standoff in the canyon, a new kind of settlement had taken root on the plains where the Cedar Creek wagon train had been destroyed. It was neither white nor Indian, but something unprecedented in the history of the frontier, a place where children played games that combined Comanche hunting skills with settler farming knowledge, where evening meals featured both cornbread and pemmican. where prayers were offered in English and Comanche to spirits that seemed to understand all languages equally well. The official records would show that Colonel Morrison had negotiated a temporary truce with Chief Horseback's band, allowing them to establish a peaceful camp on designated territory in exchange for assistance in protecting settler routes from hostile tribes. But the truth was far more complex and beautiful than any government document could capture. What had really happened was that 7 children had convinced 36 adults to try building the world differently than anyone had ever imagined possible. Esatai stood on the hill overlooking their new home, watching Rebecca teach Comanche children how to write their names in English, while Swift Eagle showed Tommy and Benjamin how to track deer without leaving footprints. The transformation had not been easy or immediate. There had been weeks of suspicion and misunderstanding, moments when old hatreds threatened to destroy the fragile peace they were trying to build. But the children had been relentless in their determination to prove that love could transcend the boundaries that divided their elders. Mary and Sarah had become the unofficial ambassadors between the Comanche women and the few white families who had joined the experimental settlement. Their natural empathy and bilingual skills made them perfect interpreters not just of language, but of cultural customs that could easily cause offense if misunderstood. They had learned to weave baskets in the Comanche style while teaching Indian children the hymns their mother had sung during long wagon train evenings. James, who had been so traumatized by the storm that he barely spoke for weeks, had found his voice again through the patient mentoring of an old Comanche medicine man who recognized the signs of a wounded spirit. Under gentle guidance, the boy had learned to channel his pain into helping others, becoming something between a counselor and a healer for anyone in the settlement who struggled with nightmares or loss. Little David, whose head injury had left him slower than the other children, but somehow more perceptive about emotional undercurrents, had become the settlement's unofficial peacemaker. When conflicts arose between adults who still saw each other as former enemies, David would appear with his innocent questions and simple observations that cut through complex prejudices like arrows finding their mark. Captain Blackwood had resigned his commission rather than return to a world where his experience in the canyon would be dismissed as fantasy or treason. He had established himself as the settlement's liaison with territorial authorities, using his reputation and connections to create legal protections for their unusual community. His reports to Austin carefully described their success in preventing Indian raids while avoiding mention of the methods that made such success possible. Colonel Morrison visited monthly, ostensibly to inspect the security arrangements, but actually to witness the ongoing miracle of former enemies learning to live as neighbors. He had seen enough warfare to recognize something precious when it appeared, and he had made himself the unofficial protector of an experiment that challenged everything the frontier had taught him about the impossibility of peace. Chief Horseback had become something unprecedented in Comanche culture, a war leader who had chosen diplomacy over destruction without losing the respect of his warriors. His band had grown as other Comanche groups sought to join a community where their children could learn white skills without abandoning Indian wisdom, where survival depended on cooperation rather than conquest. As winter approached and the settlement prepared for its first season as a permanent community, Esatai gathered his 7 children around the fire that had become the heart of their rebuilt world. They were no longer the terrified, dust-covered survivors he had pulled from the wreckage of the storm. They had become something new, something that had never existed before in the long history of conflict between their peoples. "Do you ever regret choosing to stay with me instead of returning to white civilization?" he asked them, knowing that the question needed to be answered honestly as they prepared to face the challenges of building something that had no precedent or guarantee of success. Rebecca, now 15 and showing the wisdom that came from bridging 2 worlds daily, spoke for all of them with the confidence that had made her their natural leader from the beginning. "Papa, we didn't choose to stay with you instead of going back to our old lives. We chose to help create a new kind." of life that never existed before. We chose to prove that families can be built from love instead of blood, that peace can grow from understanding instead of conquest, that children can teach adults how to see beyond the fears that have kept people apart for generations. Tommy, whose courage in the canyon had shamed grown warriors, added his own truth to their family story. The storm took away the families we were born into, but it gave us the chance to build the family we were meant to become. Not white, not Indian, but something better than either one alone. As the fire crackled and the stars appeared overhead, Asatai understood that his prayers had finally been answered in ways more miraculous than anything he had dared to imagine. He had asked the spirits for children and received 7 souls who would change the world. He had begged for a reason to live and found a purpose that would outlast his own lifetime. He had mourned the end of his bloodline and discovered that the most important inheritance was not genetic but spiritual. The dust storm that had brought them together was forgotten now, buried beneath seasons of growth and healing. But the love that had bloomed from that catastrophe continued to spread like seeds on the wind, carried by children who had learned that the strongest families are those who choose each other against all odds and build bridges where others see only walls.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.